Thank you all for joining us. As we call the meeting together, I'm going to first thank our friends from the NRC for joining us tonight, and I apologize for the brief bit of confusion as we arrived, but it's all been worked out fine. So the first thing we'll do is we'll call for the attendance. And Seth, where are you, Seth? Thank you very much for joining us tonight. I know it's a temporary assignment to take our minutes. So what we do at the beginning, Seth, is we go around so that you'll be able to record each of the members that's present. So, Samantha?
Hi, Sam Phillips from MEMA.
Joe Coughlin, Town of Plymouth, Nuclear Matters Committee.
Mary Waldron, Old Colony Planning Council.
Pine Dubois, appointee as Speaker of the House.
John Flores, Governor's appointee.
Dave Johnston, Mass DP. I represent the Secretary of EEA.
Kevin O'Reilly, Town of Plymouth, Speaker's appointee.
Sean Mullen, Town of Plymouth, and the Senate Minority Leader appointee.
Jack Priest, Massachusetts Department of Public Health.
Pat O'Brien, Pilgrim Station.
John Moylan, the Site Vice President at Pilgrim Station.
Paul Smith, the Utility Workers Union of America, representing the good men and women who work at Pilgrim Station.
Dan Wolf, appointee of the Senate President.
Chair determines that there is a quorum and we can proceed. The first order of business will be to review the minutes from the November 14th, 2019 meeting. Did all the members receive it?
Yes.
I know, starting with you, Sam, that there were some comments and edits. Would you like to say what you'd like?
Yeah, on page 3, there's a comment attributed to me that that MEMA has met with the communities and we could explore expanding the EPZ if needed. That's not an accurate statement, and I can't even follow the context of what that was or means, and so
Would you like it just deleted?
please.
All in favor of deleting it?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? It's deleted.
I'll abstain,
And I was as well abstaining.
So that's
That's-
John and Mary.
I was in.
Okay, that's fine. Any other changes, edits, improvements to the minutes from the November meeting?
Move to approve.
Oh, Sean,
Yeah.
I want to
sorry.
double check, because I thought we appointed John, because Brian had left by that point. I thought we had appointed John full-time by then.
In the November?
Yeah.
I was traveling, so
Brian
Kevin
was
handled
gone,
it,
yeah.
and no telling what happened.
Yeah, let me double check the letter that I sent over, but just
Yeah,
that might be the one minor note.
Okay. Let me just take a look where we want to put this. So, Patrick, are you just suggesting that you want?
Well, I just pulled it up, so we appointed him on November 13th to the, and these minutes are from,
The 14th.
yeah, so John was a full member, Brian not being in attendance should be struck, and then just put Moylan as the site representative.
All in favor of the change?
Aye.
Any opposed? Hearing none, it passes. David, can you help us get these changes done? I don't know who created these minutes.
Yes, I can get those done. I didn't jot them down. Seth, did you grab those couple of comments, changes to those minutes?
Yeah, I'll give you my copy at the end, so.
All right, yes, we can take care of that.
David, do you have a cold, or are you just interviewing for a radio job?
I don't know.
I'm glad you
I have
came.
not been to China anytime recently, okay?
right.
Just to be clear. North Carolina and Florida, but not China.
As long as you don't have red paint on your hands, you're fine in Plymouth. Let me ask, any other changes, edits, improvements to the minutes? Hearing none, is there a motion to adopt as amended?
So move.
All in favor?
Right.
All opposed? The minutes are approved. David, if you could
Abstain.
pass those along too.
Thank you.
Next item on the agenda is an update from David Johnson on both the interagency work group, the Attorney General's activities, and the NIPSI's permit. David?
Thank you. So like I do every month, I'll read these verbatim. The reason I do that is I get them from EEA and the interagency work group lead, and I want to make sure that I properly provide the information that I've received. Additionally, like always, this does not include the work of other groups like Pilgrim Watch, relative to their actions they're taking in whatever capacity that might be. So this is limited to the Commonwealth's actions. So regarding the NIPD's permit, on January 30th, 2020, EPA Region 1 issued the combined Federal Clean Waters Act, Massachusetts Clean Waters Act National Pollutant Discharge Elimination Permit, and that is a NIPD's permit. That's a surface water discharge permit, and that permit went to Holtec Decommissioning International, LLC. This is a combined permit. It's both a state permit and a federal permit, and they mirror each other. And it replaces the permit that was originally issued in 1991, which is also a combined permit, which remained in force because Pilgrim at the time timely applied for a renewal. So prior to issuance of the permit on January 30th, 2020, MassDEP certified that the limits, conditions, and requirements of the NIPD's permit will meet our Massachusetts ambient water quality standards. This is known as a water quality certification. So there's a requirement, I believe it's located at 401 of the Federal Clean Waters Act, that holds that, states that don't have primacy, like Massachusetts, provide a statement that essentially the permit is adequate in their eyes to meet their requirements. So we've provided that. Holtec and Entergy have appealed the water quality certification that we issued. So at this point, I'm really not going to be able to speak in any detail about what is in that certification because it's in litigation. But, you know, as I mentioned, that certification is an affirmation that our water quality standards are met by the permit, by the NIPD's permit. So to date, we have not received a similar appeal of the NIPD's permit. So notwithstanding the ongoing legal issues related to the transfer of the nuclear regulatory license, it is important to issue the new permit because we know it provides greater improvement to the environment, or we believe that it does, and you'll hear why in a moment, than the older permit. And the new permit provides for a 50% reduction in flow, and that will reduce overall load of pollutants to Cape Cod Bay, provides a 92 reduction in the intake cooling water, and that also is going to have positive impact on the bay, a 98% reduction in heat load to Cape Cod Bay, and requirements for stormwater pollution prevention plan and stormwater best practices, and that will also reduce the pollution load entering Cape Cod Bay. So the permit does not authorize discharges associated with decommissioning and site restoration. Instead, it would require Holtec, the current, although from our perspective disputed, licensee for the facility, to provide more information to EPA and MassDEP about potential new discharges associated with decommissioning and site restoration. So that is it for the NIPD's permit, and you know, I can answer questions if there are any. NRC updates, as folks know, there's a number of actions being taken by the Commonwealth relative to NRC's decision to transfer the license. So the Commonwealth, through the Attorney General, and with the assistance of EEA and other state agencies, is continuing to pursue multiple legal proceedings as related to NRC's decision to approve the license transfer from Entergy to Holtec and the unconditional exemption that allows Holtec to use Pilgrim's Decommissioning Trust Fund for non-commissioning purposes. Below, I'll provide an overview of what's currently underway. So as previously reported, the Commonwealth has filed petitions with the DC Circuit Court of Appeals seeking review of NRC's decision to, among other things, approve the license transfer and trust fund exemptions, and to deny a request from the Commonwealth to stay the license transfer and trust fund exemption approvals. On February 12th, 2020, the DC District consolidated the two petitions, meaning they will be heard together. The motions to dismiss the Commonwealth's first DC Circuit petition, which were filed by the NRC and Holtec and Entergy, remain pending. The original petition the Commonwealth filed with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission on February 20th, 2020, requesting to intervene in the license transfer proceeding and a hearing before the NRC to contest the license transfer application and trust fund exemption request, remains pending before NRC. So the summary there is we've have actions pending with NRC, and we have some actions pending with the DC District petition relative to the license transfer, our opposition to that, and the decisions granting some, the ability to use a trust fund for certain things beyond simply the ongoing operations relative to decommissioning. So the Commonwealth remains open to a comprehensive settlement with the company to resolve the pending litigation. And lastly, on February 13th, 2020, the state of New York filed a petition with the NRC seeking to intervene in the license transfer proceeding regarding Indian Point and requesting a hearing to contest the transfer. New York's petition focuses primarily on financial assurance issues. That's all I have for this month.
David, do you see any problem of incorporating that, since it's a printed statement, to make it easier for Seth, just to include that in the minutes?
That's a great idea.
Okay.
Thank you.
So that shall be done. Are there any questions of David at this point? I have a couple.
Sure.
Could you expand at all on where you think the discussions are, and I understand you're under constraints, where the discussions are now between the state and Holtec?
I can't expand other than to say they're ongoing, and our goals remain the same.
Okay. Okay. Any other questions?
Can you just
Yep.
clarify the importance of the Indian Point?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it's really just provided as information. You know, Indian Point is another one of the facilities that Holtec has taken licensed for. So I think that's the issue.
Are the petitions similar, or?
All I have is my notes, and the notes claim that the petition is limited to financial assurance mechanisms. So it may be more comprehensive. I don't know that to be the case. You know, as you know, we have filed for issues beyond the financial assurance mechanisms.
Any other questions? I have one other one. Could you go back to your notes and review exactly again the section that tells us what the reduction will be as a result of the permit?
I can. So my notes reflect that there's going to be a 50% reduction in flow, a 92% reduction in intake of cooling water, 98% reduction in heat load discharge, and requirements for a stormwater pollution prevention plan and stormwater best management practices.
Okay. Any other questions? Yeah, Dave. Go ahead.
Is that on hold during the appeal? Do you know?
The current permit is out in draft. So it is not final. It's still in the comment period, or the appeal period. So they're still operating under the old permit.
Thanks.
Any other questions? Yes, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Sean, we had a work group meeting prior to this, and it was clear from some of our discussions there, and I just wanted to mention it here, that this is not the only permits that that Holtec is going to need for the site cleanup. Once they start, you know, actual work to decommission it, they're going to need additional permits. So, you know, people should keep that in mind too.
Well, that's right. What we talked about, and I did highlight that in my my overview here, which I wrote. I read our summary that says the new permit does not authorize discharges associated with decommissioning and site restoration, and would instead require that Holtec seek a permit modification or a new permit, or certainly an opinion as to whether a permit modification or modification would be needed. And the principle there is that the current NIPD's permit we are reissuing addresses the operations post-shutdown, and the permit was issued or drafted in response to the application on record, and we don't have an updated application to reflect the types of decommissioning that Holtec is intending. So as that crystallizes for Holtec, they have the opportunity to submit to us to update the permit, modify it, or get a new permit. The permit we are issuing is based on the application in-house, and although the application in-house was originally submitted many years ago and was submitted for ongoing operations as well as post-shutdown operations, not including decommissioning. The current permit, because they are now shut down, is only issued for post-shutdown operations, not including decommissioning. So there'll be some activities that they could undertake related to decommissioning, so long as they didn't have any potential, reasonably feasible potential to result in a new or change in the nature of water-based pollutants that could enter Cape Cod Bay.
Any other questions? I actually do. John and Patrick, as the representatives of Holtec, do you have any comments on this update? Can you give us, since you're members of the panel, and you will be for at least another year, it looks like, do you have any comments you'd like to share?
No, I think Dave mentioned it's still in the comment period, so I'll wait until after, if we do file anything officially.
So you can't give us any insight into what the company's thinking?
Not off the top of my head. I honestly haven't been briefed on what they're thinking at that point.
Okay. Not yet, Jim. Oh.
The draft NIPI's permit is available, and the water quality certification, which has already been appealed, that was sent to EPA. The way the water quality cert, and Jim, you probably know this, is done as a document that we render a determination, and then we send that determination to EPA, and they wait to receive that in affirmation before issuing. It doesn't actually get sent to Holtec, but both of those documents are public.
Is Holtec's appeal a public document?
I believe it is. I believe so. I don't know for sure, to tell you the truth, but I believe it is.
Hearing no other questions, we're going to move on to our next agenda item. And first, let me preface it by saying thank you very much, guys. We really do appreciate the time and effort that you put in. As you know, last month's meeting, we listened to a gentleman who had some very difficult and controversial, I'd say, statements regarding the dry cask storage in the NRC. Our efforts have been from the beginning to make sure that Holtec was heard in their position. They have declined. I hope that changes, but they have declined. We are delighted that you're here tonight to tell us your side of the story. The NDCAP's primary role, as I'm sure you're aware, is to inform and educate the governor, the legislature, and the public. So we truly do appreciate you taking the time and the travel and the preparation to come and spend the evening with us. I'm sure you are very comfortable in your unique accommodations. So with that, I think the best way to begin is to stand up so Seth can make sure beyond what we have for the overhead. Just introduce yourself, and then we'll start in the presentation.
Sure. And Sean, if you don't mind, I'll take the liberty to introduce the team.
Excellent.
And we do definitely thank you.
You're going to need the mic, though.
So that at the podium?
I don't know.
I think it should make it.
I don't know if it'll reach. You're being serviced here by the senator, so.
A very dangerous thing, but it looks like it will reach.
Thank you, Senator.
But I didn't pull it out before.
Thank you, Senator. And
Senators usually don't service us, so we appreciate it. Definitely we do appreciate the opportunity to come here and talk with you folks today. And we brought you the trifecta of experts in spent fuel management. So to my immediate left, John McKirkin, he's the branch chief down in our Rockville office, in our headquarters office in Rockville, Maryland, and he's really responsible for licensing the casks. So he has a wealth of information on licensing and our regulatory process. To his immediate left is John Nicholson, and John works with me in Region 1 at the NRC, and John is one of our senior inspectors for spent fuel management. So John is the guy who follows the casks, follows the loading, all those evolutions that occur at the plant. That's John, and he spends lots of time at Pilgrim. And to his immediate left is Daryl Dunn. Daryl is a materials engineer and an expert on our aging management programs. So we heard a little bit last meeting. We did have a chance to take a look at your last meeting, and so we brought Daryl along to sort of give some more information to the panel on how aging management works. You know, we have put together a short presentation for you. I think it'll take probably about 30 minutes if we can accommodate that. And then we're certainly prepared to answer any of the questions that NDCAP may have. We did, like I said, we did have the opportunity to view your last meeting on YouTube. And we really look forward to providing you additional information to assist you in making a balanced assessment of the NRC's programs and process to assure safety of spent fuel management. And one of the things you'll see is we're going to put up some slides, and you'll see some pictures. And I just want to focus you on the pictures. These are actual casks. These are actual casks with fuel loaded in the casks. And you'll see the proximity of guys like John and John to those casks. We heard some things last month on the hazard that these casks, when they're loaded, present. And trust me, if those casks were anywhere near those hazards, these guys wouldn't be climbing on the top of the cask or being next to the cask. So, you know, just a real focus on those. Those are actual pictures of our inspectors out in the field. As an independent regulator, the NRC has a well-thought-out licensing and oversight program for the storage of spent fuel. The program includes extensive regulations, and last month I think there was a statement that we don't understand or know what the regulations are. I think hopefully John will convince you that we certainly do know what the regulations are. I think this group certainly is very familiar with all the regulations the NRC has for spent fuel management. We're going to talk a little bit about aging management. Daryl's going to take care of that. We do have extensive programs for aging management, and you'll see when Daryl goes through his presentation how well thought out those programs are. Oversight by our inspectors during all aspects of cask fabrication and design, and including loading the cask at the site. So we have inspectors from headquarters that go to Holtec, and they review the cask fabrication. They do inspections of that, and then John would do the on-site inspections. And then we're also going to touch on security and emergency planning. We heard that there was some concerns over our security of spent fuel management and emergency planning, and would like to provide you a little bit of information on that. So we're going to touch, we hope, on all the aspects that you heard last month. The other thing I wanted to point out is, while our time is kind of limited tonight, we did put some references together that are on the back of our presentation. We're not going to run through those tonight, obviously, but if you want, to us, these are the best references to really the information that you need, I think, to make a real balanced and informed decision. And there's one document that I will definitely point out to you, because it's kind of short and simple reading. But on January 23rd of this year, the Commission issued a Federal Register notice that we get petition review board decision, and this decision is specifically on spent fuel, and it has everything to do with what the concerns you've heard last month. It has to do with, you know, EP, security, hardened casks, thin-walled casks. All those things that were described to you last month, this petition review board decision addresses all those in the NRC's position on all those issues. And with that said, I'm going to turn it over to John to get us started with licensing.
So thank you, Jim. Is there a way for us to advance the slides there?
Right on top of the podium.
Yeah, there's a clicker.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Van.
Great.
If you can get a couple more chairs, we'd appreciate it. Oh, you want it to work?
They may be blocked by the...
That's it.
You may have to...
If you want to pass it here and just tell us when to advance it, we could do that.
Are you a pro at this?
There you go.
Oh, there we go. So,
just the thought of you getting up just get it.
All right, thank you, thank you. Jim, I just want to take a minute on the mission. So that is the NRC's mission. We are an independent regulator. You know, our mission is protecting public health and safety. So if we could go to the next slide. Thank you. So I just want to start very high level, very basic, talk about what an independent spent fuel storage installation is. You'll see some graphics there, and we'll have a bunch of pictures here because I think the pictures are very helpful. But so an ISFSI, and you'll forgive me if I use those acronyms, I think you'll get very used to that, that term. It's just a means for supplemental storage. They have been used throughout the country. They have been demonstrated to be a safe and efficient and effective means of storing spent fuel. While on the pad, These are passive systems. They don't require power. There's no pumps, valves, or active cooling systems that are required. So there's very little to fail in that case while they're sitting there on the pad. There are a number of vendors. Holtec is just one vendor that provides spent fuel storage casks. They can be stored horizontally or vertically. So if you look on the lower left there, you'll see the two different configurations. The NRC doesn't really get into the details of how the casks are stored with respect to horizontal or vertical, as long as they meet our safety requirements, and I'll talk a lot about that in a moment. So there are 76 ISFSIs in operation around the country in 35 states, so Pilgrim's not alone there. The Holtec High Storm 100 system here at Pilgrim is stored vertically. It's stored under a general license, and I'll talk about general licenses and specific licenses. Those are two different licensing approaches for spent fuel storage. Under the general license, the utility must select a cask from our regulations that's been reviewed and approved by the NRC. All the systems have to meet the same safety standards, the same safety requirements, and the NRC doesn't compare and contrast one design versus another as long as they meet our minimum standards. And those requirements are codified in the regulations. I'm going to talk a lot about Part 72. Part 72 214 is the regulation that lists the approved casks, and utilities can select from any of the list that meets their needs. So there are a number of operational and business decisions that go into the selection of any particular cask design, and the NRC allows the general licensee to select from that list as long as it meets their requirements, and all of those casks meet our regulations. So we go to the next slide. So the high-level requirement, again, is reasonable assurance of adequate protection of public health and safety. That's safety is our focus, safety is our mission. Many of the key safety requirements are codified in Part 72, and you can go and read that regulation. They are generally performance-based requirements. They're not very prescriptive, and I'm going to talk about a couple of examples. Following the passage of the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, the NRC revised its regulations. We added Subpart K, which provided for the general license that Pilgrim has, and then also Subpart L, which provides for the specific design requirements that the cask has to meet in order to be used. I'll give you an example. 72-236 A through N is a long list of very specific technical requirements that the cask has to meet. An example of that is 236F. And so that regulation states that the spent fuel storage cask must be designed to provide for adequate heat removal capacity without active cooling systems. And so this is the way the regulation is promulgated to ensure that the systems are passive, that there's no chance for the failure of pumps or valve alignments that are going to cause problems with the cask. Conceptually, I'm going to stay here for just a minute. So conceptually, at a high level, if you understand the Part 50 process, you'll see a lot of parallels with the Part 72 process. So don't forget all of your Part 50 stuff, because we're going to use it tonight. So the dry cask regulations have very similar things. There's a requirement for a final safety analysis report. There's a requirement for technical specifications that limit the cask. There are requirements for exemptions, and we're going to talk about an exemption later tonight. And so these are all parallels to the Part 50 process. There is also a provision in Part 72 to allow the licensee to make minor changes to the cask or to the facility, very much like the 50-59 process in reactor space. So these are changes, minor changes that meet a certain threshold that's spelled out in the regulation, and it allows the licensee to make some small changes on their own without prior NRC approval. But those changes are subject to oversight, and my colleague John Nicholson will talk about our oversight program. So the safety requirements are listed here. On the left side, maintain confinement, provide for adequate protection of the radiation shielding for workers and the public, prevent criticality, and maintain retrievability. These are interim facilities, so retrievability is important. You have to do all of these things while resisting earthquakes, tornadoes, floods, extreme temperatures, all of the typical natural hazards and man-made hazards that you would experience. And so all of those safety functions have to be maintained under those conditions. In addition to Part 72, there are a number of other regulations that are relevant here, and I want to just speak to them briefly. Part 73 of the regulations describes the physical protection. These are the guns, guards, gates. Part 2 provides for rules of practice and procedures. These are important procedural elements. Part 71 provides for transportation. I know transportation isn't really the focus of our talk here tonight, but it is something we get a lot of questions about. People do want to get the fuel transported eventually, and the NRC is ready. I do have a slide later, and so I'll speak a little bit further about transportation there. If I could go to the next slide, thanks. So I want to talk a little bit about the licensing process. The NRC takes its responsibility to review the safety of cask designs very seriously. The High Storm 100 canister design has been amended a number of times to accommodate new contents or design changes based on utilities and Holtec's customers' needs to store specific fuel types and heat loads. Each amendment is carefully reviewed by a team of engineers, such as Daryl here, and scientists to ensure the design meets the NRC requirements. During the review, the staff can hold meetings with the cask vendor. These meetings are open to the public, and there's always a portion of that meeting where members of the public can ask questions of the NRC staff to talk about the material that was discussed during the meeting. Additionally, and this is a little different from the Part 50 process, at the end of a certification of a design cask, there is a rulemaking procedure that goes to certify that cask, and during that rulemaking, there is also another comment period for public comments to talk about the changes that are being proposed in that rule. So let's go to the next slide. So I want to talk a little bit further about that licensing process. As I mentioned, the NRC regulations are performance-based. Another example of a regulation that I'll give you is 72236C. And in that regulation, that requires the spent fuel cask must be designed and fabricated so that the spent fuel is maintained subcritical. So I mentioned that maintaining it subcritical is important. But that rule talks about under credible conditions. And so this is an important concept. It applies in reactor space, but I want to talk about it a little bit in spent fuel space. So that regulation, that is a high-level requirement. It's a performance-based requirement. And to evaluate the design for compliance with that requirement, the staff develops standard review plans. Not unlike in Part 50, you have the SRP to guide the staff in conducting their reviews. The staff can also issue regulatory guides, which are acceptable methods to meet the regulations, and that's very similar to Part 50 in the reactor space. And those reg guides provide acceptable means to the staff and the licensee on how to meet the regulations. We have a link at the end excuse me, of the presentation where you can go to the SRP and look very specifically at what the reviewers are looking for when they review cask design. But I mentioned that phrase, credible conditions. And so this is important to the staff and to the licensees. And so through regulation and guidance, the staff has documented what conditions must be considered during the review. And the cask vendor, Holtec in this case, has to provide test or analysis results that demonstrate that their cask can survive these conditions and maintain the safety functions that were called for in the regulations. The staff has discretion to perform their own independent confirmatory analysis if needed to challenge the applicant in their analysis. And through these detailed technical reviews, the staff can impose additional limitations or conditions on the cask, and those are codified in the Certificate of Compliance. The COC, together with the technical specifications for the design, limit the total heat capacity of the design, maximum allowable dose rates, and other important parameters for the safety of the design. The regulations originally limited the initial certification term to 20 years. Subsequently, that initial license term has been modified, so now the initial term can be 40 years, and all of those casks are subject to the possibility of a renewal for an additional 40 years. And so renewal takes us to the next part. I'm going to turn it over to Daryl, and he's going to turn it back to me, but Daryl's going to talk about aging management, which is critical as we go through the staff.
Okay. For systems that are going to go through with the renewal process after the initial license period is reached, we require those systems to have to be assessed for their aging management needs. And the way this is done is first by a scoping evaluation, and this identifies the components, the structure systems and components of that dry storage system that have an important safety function or are relied on for an important safety function. Anything that gets scoped in, something that's relied on for important to safety, has to go through an aging management review. And in this review, we look at the materials that component is made out of, the environments that they operate in, and the aging management review has to assess the possible aging mechanisms and the effects of those aging mechanisms. It has to consider things that might happen, and it has to consider things that we know have already happened. The outcome of that aging management review is one of three things: no action, so there's no credible aging mechanisms or effects. That could happen if a system is in an embedded environment and it's simply not subject to an environment where aging can occur. A time-limited aging analysis, and these are typically calculations, something like a fatigue analysis where you have a very well-established type of loading scenario, or an aging management program, which are activities to detect and prevent aging effects and perform corrective actions. And since aging management programs get the majority of our scrutiny during renewal applications, I'll provide a little more detail on that. Next slide. So on the left is listed the 10 elements of an aging management program. When we receive a renewal application, we go through that aging management program and we look for the details that are provided in that. We have updated our regulatory guidance, New Reg 1927 Revision 1, our standard review plan for renewals. That document's publicly available. We provided the Adams accession number for that. It provides the details of what we are looking for in the review of an aging management program. In general, we are looking for what is the component that is being looked at here, what are the possible aging effects that are being looked at, what type of parameters are going to be inspected or monitored, how are those inspections going to occur, what type of methods are going to be used, how frequently do they need to be done, what is the acceptance criteria, what is the basis for that acceptance criteria, and is that sufficient to be able to catch an aging effect before we get a loss of intended function. How will that data be collected? How will it be monitored to assess whether or not corrective actions are needed? There are controls in place like a confirmation process and administrative controls that basically assure that the aging management program is implemented properly and that corrective actions, if they are needed, are completed. And the aging management program also has to consider operating experience, both before the application is submitted to the NRC, but there also has to have a means by which the aging management program will continue to assess a relevant operating experience for that dry cask storage system. In addition to reviewing these aging management programs, when they come in for renewal, we have also are in the process of developing an inspection procedure for the implementation of these aging management programs. And we did do an assessment of 5 storage systems that have been renewed over the past few years. And we looked at how these aging management programs were implemented, and the results of that assessment will go into the development of an inspection procedure for implementation of aging management programs. And the only other thing I want to mention here is New Reg 2214. This is our Managing Aging Process and Storage Report. We looked at 10 different storage systems that are going to go through renewals, or we think are going to go through renewals in the next 10 years. So this covers the majority of the systems that we've already licensed. We went through the whole process of doing the scoping evaluation, the aging management review, and assessing whether or not aging management was necessary, and if so, what type of aging management would be appropriate. Chapter 3 of that report includes assessments of materials that include carbon steel, stainless steels, nickel alloys, aluminum alloys, copper alloys, neutron absorber materials, neutron shielding materials, concrete, and spent fuel. And it has hundreds of technical references included in that chapter.
Chapter 4 looks at, identifies the results of those assessments for the 10 different systems. And Chapter 5 has several example aging management programs. A licensee can choose to use that example aging management program if they want to, or they can go their own way and develop their own. But either way, the aging management program that they submit in their renewal application gets reviewed, and it's subject to inspection after it's implemented. Okay, next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some canister inspections, and these pictures were taken in 2016 and 2018 at the Maine Yankee ISFSI. And so what you're looking at here is the top of a spent fuel storage system. The blue round thing is the lid on top of the dry cask storage system. Underneath that is a shield plug, and those are going to be removed, and we're going to have direct access to the canister that was loaded with spent fuel back in 2002. The outlet vent screen has also been loosened and temporarily repositioned so that a inspection crawler can go into that outlet vent and down into the interior of that dry cask storage system, so we can look at the interior surface of the overpack, which is a painted carbon steel surface. And we also look at the canister, which is a welded stainless steel, and do some radiation and temperature measurements, and also collect some samples. Next slide. So after these two pictures are taken after the lid and the shield plug are removed, at the top right, these are staff from Maine Yankee, and they are collecting some surface deposits that have collected on this cask after 16 years of service. And these are going to be analyzed, and were analyzed by Sandia National Laboratories. And on the bottom left is an inspector. He is actually on the surface of the canister, and the reason for that is the canister has a pretty thick lid, and then it also has a shield plug underneath that. So the lowest dose is actually for him to do the inspection of the closure well is for him to actually be on top of the canister. That dose rate is about 8 millirem per hour. To put it in perspective, a dental x-ray is about 9 millirem, okay? So he conducted that inspection. It took probably about 30 minutes, and it probably took about the same amount of time to collect the samples from the top of the canister. Next slide, okay. So this is a couple of images of the inspection crawlers on different canisters. At the top left, this is the crawler on inside of the spent fuel storage canister, and it has both a radiation monitor and a temperature sensor. That canister had a fairly low heat load, and the lowest temperature on that canister at the bottom where that crawler is right now is about 84 degrees Fahrenheit. At the top, it was a little more than that. It was about 99. And the radiation levels on the inside of the system varied as a function of height, but the highest dose rate was about 311 rads per hour. On the right, it shows a couple of images from the crawler from a greater than Class C canister inspection. At the top, at the top left of that figure, you're looking at the canister, and then it's sort of the bottom right, you're looking at the canister overpack. You can see the circumferential welds in both of those. The images from this camera system, which is used to do a variety of inspections, is extremely high quality. It actually uses an array of cameras, so you can do things like area measurements, distance measurements, depth measurements if there's a depression or a gouge. And everything looks magnified. So any grinding mark that you see anywhere, or any discoloration, wrinkle in the paint is clearly visible. The crawler itself works by having magnetic wheels, so it actually attaches to the side of the overpack, and it transverses, you go all the way to the bottom, to the top, around the circumference of the canister as needed. So the bottom line is, we can inspect canisters. There's technology to do so. There's other tools that can be attached to these crawlers, but the systems are inspectable.
Great. Thanks, Darrell. Let's go to the next slide. So I just have two other points I wanted to touch on briefly, and then I'm going to turn it over to John Nicholson here. One is consolidated interim storage facilities. We do get a lot of questions about where the fuel could go, and there are two facilities currently under review by the NRC. And so, as I mentioned, Pilgrim has a general license, and so they can only store their own fuel. Under the specific license, a licensee could take other people's fuel. And so the business model, and I'm not regulating the business model, I'm just communicating for Holtec and for interim storage partners there, is to collect and consolidate fuel in these facilities. So there are, as I mentioned, two applications. They are still under review. We're well into it. Some major milestones that folks could monitor if they were interested in this. We're preparing for public meetings on the draft environmental impact statement. That'll be coming in spring of 2020, actually for both of the applications. The bulk of the meetings are held near the site, so these are out in New Mexico and in West Texas. Then our schedule is for completion of our safety evaluation report and issuance of our environmental impact statements in March and May of 2021. And so these are consolidated interim storage facilities, so you can watch for those. The other item I wanted to mention is transportation. That is something we get a lot of questions as we've been to other community engagement panels. Just for everybody's awareness, the NRC and Department of Transportation actually co-regulate the shipment of spent fuel. Department of Transportation has the overall lead for the shipment of all hazardous materials in the U.S., and we have a memorandum of understanding between the NRC and DOT laying out the roles and responsibilities of the two agencies. DOT regulates the carriers and modes of transport, rail, road, and those types of things, and then the NRC establishes the design standards for the spent fuel transportation packages. So these are the packages that the canister would be placed in this package for shipment across the country. A couple of key points I want to share with everybody. So spent fuel has been moved successfully in this country quite a bit. Certainly the U.S. Navy has an excellent track record on shipping spent fuel, a flawless record. But even commercially, under the auspices of our oversight and our regulatory framework together with the Department of Transportation, commercial entities in the 80s, 90s, and through the 2000s were moving spent fuel to manage their inventories. And so this is not something that's radically new or different from what's currently been done. There are packages that have been fabricated. They do exist, and there is an excellent track record even for commercial shipment of spent fuel in this country. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to John Nicholson here.
Thank you, John. I'm an inspector that comes out. We're actually like the boots on the ground. We're the folks that come out to the site and oversee the loading of the canisters. Just to give you a start, this is an actual photograph of the Pilgrim ISFSI, and they've loaded their first system in 2015. There are currently 17 casks, high storm casks on the pad. They use what's called the multi-purpose canister. At the NRC, we love our acronyms, so everything has an acronym, and you'll hear MPC quite frequently. And 68 simply refers to, that's the model number, that's the number of assemblies that are in each canister. Next slide, please. Here's a cross view of a typical canister. This is both the overpack and the inside the canister, the MPC, loaded with spent fuel assemblies. That's it's a very robust. That's like 2 feet plus thick of concrete with stainless steel, carbon steel. As John mentioned, these are, the design on these is passively air-cooled, so there's no power required. These things, once they sit on the pad, they are cooling just by cool air coming in at the bottom vents, going up along the sides of the can, and the heat is dissipated through the vents up at the top. Now, we also heard, too, some last time there were some different temperatures and pressures that were mentioned. Just to give you an example, at Pilgrim, now this is not the outside of the concrete itself, because the outer pack, that concrete, that's pretty much whatever the ambient temperature is. If it's cold outside, that concrete is going to be cold. If it's hot outside and the sun's beating out, that concrete is going to be hot. But the inner can itself, the inner stainless steel can, when that was loaded with fuel, because they have to take a temperature on that, and that was 150 degrees of the extra on the, and that was right after the fuel was loaded, and that was the hottest can that's been loaded at Pilgrim. And in terms of like internal pressure, again, that's 70 degrees PSI. To put that in perspective, I think again there's some connotation that these are somehow there's a tremendous amount of pressure in here and they're ready to go and you need to really. It's 70 pounds, again, hottest can, 70 PSI, which is equivalent, you go I went for a bike ride this weekend, filled up the tires. My bike tires running about 85 PSI and in a rubber tube. So just to give you some perspective on what kind of temperatures and pressures we're talking about here. At 150 degrees, it's like equivalent to say an old building that might have cast iron radiators on there. It's that kind of temperature. And the other thing too is I've heard these referred to that these are maybe kind of lined up like bowling pins and that they could be easily knocked around. I don't know what kind of bowling ball you might use to do that, but these things weigh 180 tons, so it would take one heck of a bowling ball to kind of scatter these things around. So they're tremendously heavy and robust containers. Next slide, please. This is on the left-hand side. That is a photograph of a fabrication facility. What you're seeing is the installation of that's not an actual component of a canister. That's one of a roller for rolling out the steel to fabricate the canisters. But my NRC colleagues in our headquarters location, they oversee the design and the fabrication of these casks. So they might go to the corporate offices of Holtec to take a look at the design of these cans. And then what they'll do is they'll go out to the fabrication facilities that are all over the world. And they'll look at the quality control to make sure that these components are being fabricated as per the design. And on the right-hand side, that's also a photograph of Pilgrim, but I just found out today that I got to update this slide because they traded in the old model transporter here for a new model transporter, so I've got to update that one. But the one they have now is it's got tank treads on it, and again, a very robust machine that will move these canisters around out of the reactor building and place them on the pad. Next slide, please. Now, here's again, what you can see there on the photograph is that is I think the person in the pink shirt is actually what we call the NDE person. They're the non-destructive examination of the weld. And next to her is one of our NRC inspectors. And again, this is a loaded canister, so you see these people are right up on top of the can. Now, you have to be certainly cognizant of dose, but the doses are manageable, the temperatures are manageable as well as you're standing up there. But the point I'm trying to make here is that when we are on site, we are elbow to elbow with the folks that are doing the loading, doing the welding, doing the drying of the canister. We're there, a lot of times these operations are 24-hour operations, and we're there on off shifts, and we're there making sure that they're following their procedures. That's what we do. We're up there, and it's not just the loading, but it's also, even before we get to all that, what's happening at Pilgrim now. We were up there just a while back just looking at the pad construction. So we review the pad design, and then we come up to make sure that the pad is constructed as per the design. So we're out there watching the concrete get poured, and again, like I say, just being on hand to make sure that we can feel comfortable that they did things per the design. Also, we also do dry runs without spent fuel, because you know, that's something you want to make sure you get that right, and there's a lot of moving parts, a lot of equipment that's involved with this. So we do dry runs without spent fuel, and we do that as if everything is kind of, we're sort of acting as if it was all real fuel and following the procedures, but there's no fuel that's being used, just to kind of make sure that procedures are worked out and that everything's going to go smoothly. And then there's just the routine monitoring that the licensee performs. And we're also checking on that they're doing their 24-hour checks of the, that's required. They actually do them at Pilgrim. They do them every 12 hours. But, you know, we make sure that the monitoring that they're required to do, that they're doing that as well. Next slide, please. And this is just like I say, the requirement is that you got to make sure that those, again, because these are passively cooled, so you got to make sure that those vents are clear. If those vents are clear, that heat is going to be dissipating. And so they do it, like I say, they do it there every 12 hours. There's also monthly radiation protection surveys of the pad. And again, that's one other thing we take a look at when we're on site. And just an example, again, the hottest can that's sitting on the Pilgrim pad right now, which, and let me kind of back up, because I think there was some, again, there was some question about like what kind of temperatures. And I like to put things in analogies. I think it kind of helps to bring that into context. But the hottest can at Pilgrim is, we did a calculation, it comes out to, it's the equivalent of a little over 3 conventional household ovens cranked up. And that's kind of the heat we're talking about in those things. And at the outside surface of that concrete canister, we're talking about a dose on contact of 1 millirem. And I think Daryl mentioned there about a dental x-ray being about 9 millirems. So basically, you'd have to have your face up against that high storm for 9 hours to get the equivalent of a dental x-ray. And again, and at the periphery, at the edge of the pad, this is not even getting off site, but just at the edge of the pad, the existing pad that's on site, not the new pad, but the existing pad where those 17 cans are, we're getting meter readings of 0.2 to 0.3 MR per hour. Background in this room right now might be 0.05, 0.06, something like that, to put that in perspective. So we're, and to go back to those temperatures and pressures that we were talking about, not to go back on the slides, but just to go back on those things, you know, that's when it was first loaded, and over time, those things are decreasing. Those values are decreasing over time. The security, again, there's some questions or some question about what kind of security. These really are hardened targets. You know, the idea that this is kind of like maybe Barney Fife with the bullet, with the gun with no bullets in it and a flashlight or something, that is not the case at all. These are hardened targets. These security guards they're armed with military-style weapons. This is just not a, it's not it's not a site that could, that you would easily breach or attack. And it's maintained, as long as the fuel is on site, the security is maintained. Next slide, please. And emergency planning. Again, that's another thing that, as long as the fuel is on site, there's emergency planning. In fact, I think at Pilgrim, they're ongoing right now with getting in your local fire folks to be familiar with the site. Things like that go on all the time. At standalone ISFSIs, we commonly have emergency drills that are hostile action, that are medical emergencies, and they get participants including FEMA, FBI, they get state police, they get local fire and ambulance folks responding to these. So there's emergency planning and drills that are conducted on a regular basis, and we've been up to observe some of these drills as well. Next slide, please. Okay.
Again, that completes our prepared comments. Certainly, hopefully we conveyed that, we do have a robust regulatory process for licensing casks. We certainly do have, we heard that there was no aging management program. Certainly, we have an aging management program that Daryl described, and we are focused on security and emergency preparedness. So with that, we're open to questions.
Any questions? Start with you, Kev.
Again, I want to thank you for taking the time and coming up to us. I found it to be very informative. I just had a few questions related to you overseeing the design and the fabrication. And I'm hoping maybe you can provide some answers to us that Holtec hasn't been able to provide. And one of the big questions that we've had is related to the warranty. Correct me if I'm wrong, I heard 40 years on the license with a 40-year renewal. Are we to assume that, as far as the NRC is concerned, that this is a warranty for 40 years or with a 40-year renewal, or how do you view that?
All right. So let me first get some common terminology down. What I talked about during my presentation are the terms of the certificate. So when the NRC looks at that design, we evaluate it over that licensed term. So folks like Daryl will look at the material performance over the licensed term, and we will certify that the applicant has presented to us and we have affirmed that the materials will perform their safety functions during that term. Similarly, during renewal, we will look again and make sure that those materials and components will perform their safety functions during that term. When you start talking about warranties, you start talking about financial liability issues. And the NRC is a safety organization. We have a fairly narrow focus on financial matters, only as they relate to the ability of the facility to operate safely. And so we do not overly engage in subcontracting or liability. We do review the financial capability of a licensee, but we do not have specific regulations that would drive us to investigate warranty terms. The licensee is always responsible for the safety of the facility, and it is the licensee we hold accountable for that through our oversight, inspection, and enforcement. So I don't think you're going to get a super satisfying answer from the NRC as well on warranty, because those are really business matters that we don't regulate beyond their impact on safety.
Well, thanks for the clarity on that. Following up on that, we'll leave the warranty and financial aside for the moment. If you were to find that after coming up on 40 years or before 40 years, and there was a safety issue, we've heard the Russian doll method of fixing. Is there something prescribed if there is an issue with what you would do if a defective cask was found?
So I'll begin where I started. We do review and seek to ensure that the device will operate for its term, and we do have an oversight program. So in the event that precursors were found that might challenge the safety function, and I think that's what you're postulating, we have an oversight program that is intended to detect that. The bulk of our efforts are really focused on detection and prevention of issues like the one you described, where you've got a leaking cask. And we have not had that experience in the U.S., so I think that's an indicator of the success of the regulatory framework and our oversight program, ensuring that the licensees are maintaining the safety functions of their components. But I don't want to not answer your question. Let me go on. And so in the event that the licensee were to detect some condition adverse to safety, they have a corrective action program that they're required to maintain, and they have to find a way to bring the cask back into compliance. So our regulations are not prescriptive in that you must do it this way or that way, an overpack, so we do not prescribe exactly how they do that, but we do require that they meet that. And through our oversight program, we would inspect any operation that they would propose to bring the cask back into compliance.
Thank you. And I won't dominate the time. I have just one more question for now, and I'll defer to the rest of the panel. You mentioned up in Maine that you did an inspection of the cask that had been in existence up there for 16 years. I assume that's not the first time that you inspected up there. How often do you inspect the casks?
So what that was a pre-application inspection for the NAC systems, because they are going to go through renewal here in 2020. There's two certificate of compliance systems that the NAC MPC and the NAC UMS that are coming up on their original term. So that inspection was conducted at that site because it was determined to be, the most aggressive site with the oldest spent fuel in storage, and so that inspection was conducted to support that renewal application, that you could in fact inspect the canisters and that there were really no aging effects identified on those systems. But to answer your question, so that we have renewals that have been approved where the inspections occur every 5 years. Calvert Cliff's done 2 inspections. They did one in 2012 and in 2017. And we have some renewals that have gone to 10-year inspections if they can support that with their aging management assessment.
What would be the norm?
Probably going to be more like 10.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions from members of the panel?
Yes, Mr. Mullen.
Pat,
Okay, if I
please,
could.
Paul.
Like the good Mr. O'Reilly, I'd like to thank the professionals of the NRC for coming to town, for taking the time, their presentation. I think my question is in regards to materials and environment, so I direct it to Darrell, is that correct?
Yes.
And it's in regards to the aging management program, and actually it's the consequences of what it is we're trying to avoid. We enjoy, certainly, but we probably don't take credit for it because it's margin, but the lessening of the heat load, the lessening of the rad levels, and even the natural decay of the radionuclides within the fuel as they go into their more solid states. So if at the end of the initial license certification after 20 years, should there be a hairline crack in a canister, what would the hazard to the public be? I mean, once that 70 PSI of gas used to transfer the heat within the canister is lost, then there's no driving force. And perhaps I'm being simplistic, but I wonder, because the concern has been raised, we have a salt atmosphere because of the ocean. So what if there should be a hairline crack at the weld? Or it would take 2 welds cracking, wouldn't it?
So the risk is low. That's been put out in our, I believe it's New Reg 1864, our risk analysis of dry cask storage systems, which actually used the whole High Storm 100 as the basis for that review. That's an extensive review of the different types of events that could occur and the consequences of those events. I would say that having a crack after 20 years is a very, very low possibility. Even our canister at Maine Yankee, which was a really, really low heat load, it's still too warm after 16 years to even start, initiation of corrosion. So it's going to take a long time. If you have a higher heat load canister, it's really going to take a long time to even get the conditions where that could occur.
Follow-up question? Through the
Yes,
chair?
go ahead.
But probably the audience, they're looking more for what would be the effects of it, if that, albeit probably infinitesimally low probability were to happen. A hairline crack.
It would be less than what we have in our analysis in New Reg 1864, which was very low consequence.
Okay. Because I think of it again simplistically, that if it weren't for the dry cask, they'd just be sitting in a pool of water with no pressure monitoring. So it would be bubbling up, if there were anything. Thank you.
Senator Wolf?
Just a couple of questions. What is the area of the top of the canister, roughly? Looks like it's about 3 feet by 3 feet.
Oh, no, it's about 6 feet in diameter.
6 feet in diameter?
Yeah.
So I'm just trying to get like square inches of the top of that thing.
Pi r
Probably
squared.
a couple of thousand square inches. So if you take a couple of thousand square inches times 70, which is the pressure per square inch, I mean, it sounds like you're really minimalizing it by saying, well, it's only 70, bicycle pressure, et cetera. If you take 70 times, let's say 5,000 square inches, what you're talking about there is a force of 350,000 pounds. You realize that? Just so that everybody understands sort of how that adds up. So the actual pressure on the lid of that canister is about 350,000 pounds. So if you equate that to an automobile or a locomotive, that's actually a lot of force. So, I mean, I love the fact that you present it in a way that it doesn't sound like a lot. It's actually a lot of force. A follow-up question would be, that wasn't a question, so I could put a question mark at the end and then you could say, oh. My next question would be, it looks like you're really focused on the security. I mean, I'm looking at people with kind of high-powered weapons, et cetera. If we've diminished the risk of what we're storing here, what exactly are these people guarding that site from? What is the worst-case scenario that they're trying to prevent?
Okay. I won't address the security question, but I will address the pressure question.
Sure.
So the accident pressure for an MPC 68 is 200 psi.
Yep.
If you take a MPC 68 with a maximum heat load, maximum helium backfill, maximum temperature, and assume 100% fuel rod failure, the maximum pressure you can get to is 152 psi.
That's assuming no defect in manufacturing, which I know you guys are monitoring the manufacturing, but the point I was making wasn't that that's enough to blow it off. The point I was making was there is a lot of force on the inside of that canister. And to sort of equate it to a bike tire diminishes the fact that there is a lot of force in there, that if the manufacturing was not, if that process had a flaw in it, and I've dealt with weld failures and all kinds of things. I mean, welding is a science, it's an art as well. And, there is a comfort level there relative to the forces involved. But that, I just wanted to sort of put that in the on the table. From a security standpoint, what is it that we need such high-level security? I mean, if there was no risk and everything was so, perfectly stored, why do we need it surrounded with basically a permanent military-style security force?
The answer is probably dispersion. You know, that would be your number one thing, right, is basically the scenario of a dirty bomb, and you could get in there somehow and it disperse the material.
And what would the impact of that be?
Well, you know, there's a lot of studies on dirty bombs and the footprint of a dirty bomb. I mean, it all depends, obviously, on the amount of explosive material, but I think you'd be surprised, and I'm sure this, your state guys could show you, the footprint of a dirty bomb, usually in a city, a small one, is a matter of blocks. It's not like, you know, the city goes away. So, you know, there's an awful lot of variables you're asking for.
And my only closing comment / question, and maybe you'd want to opine on it and maybe not. In the industry I'm in, highly regulated, the airline industry, highly regulated, a lot of approvals for certification of process and equipment. We're all familiar with the 737 MAX and the relationship between Boeing, which has a lot more of a track record and credibility than Holtec does, and the FAA, which has its own history, but I have a lot of regard for that regulatory agency, I really do. But the concern I have on a very low risk but high consequence event is the relationship between the regulatory oversight, and this is not to question the integrity and the sincerity and the job you're doing, but certainly someone in the public would be concerned looking at that. And I hear 76 sites that we're storing fuel at. That aircraft had tens of thousands of departures and flights before any problem at all surfaced. And again, relative to the consequence at a nuclear site, the tragic 2 losses, those 2 accidents, are actually relatively low probability, but also low risk relative to, obviously not to the people on board and their families, but to the general public. The consequences of this, even though it's low risk, the consequences are sort of squishy because there's public safety and then there's the economic and financial consequences. And I'm wondering if there's any lesson learned at the NRC from the 737 MAX or sort of the failure of the process, because I know the internal logic. I deal with aging aircraft systems as well. I'm an expert in it. And I know the logic of how those programs are put together and who does it. And they're really, really good, but on the other hand, they don't always work. And a lot of what's built into an aging inspection program is lessons learned, prior lessons from systems that have aged, and you know, we learn. And in our industry, we've got decades and decades and decades of that. The nuclear industry is relatively young, you know, certainly as compared to my industry. And certainly, while I think we are developing good aging inspection programs and processes, I'm not sure it's a completely mature one. And I just wonder if you'd want to opine on that.
You know, I'd say, and we do look at other industries when we do our risk analysis and our aging management programs. I would think what happened to the aircraft, the Boeing aircraft, would be more related to an operating reactor. You know, very complex system, lots of moving parts, and so I'm sure, I'm confident that we will look hard at that event and look at it as our operating reactor PRAs. You know, we have pretty extensive PRAs.
Yeah, my only, come back to that, I'm not going to do a debate here. I'm sorry, you're giving me the hairy eye again. But the only thing to that is, while the static setup as it exists there is a relatively static, you know, not a dynamic system, that's actually not true of the manufacturing and the engineering. I mean, there's a lot of moving parts that go into what ends up just sitting there.
Correct.
And that's the concern.
And if I can go back to the first comment you had on security, you know, even with the dispersion, the challenge is you do have a canister that's, you know, hundreds of tons. You do have 3 feet or 2 feet of reinforced concrete. Even to bring the explosives in to do any type of damage, you know, you're going to have to get through a vehicle barrier system. You're going to have to place the explosive. Certainly, we have intrusion detection systems, 24/7 monitoring of the intrusion detection system in the central alarm station. Every law enforcement agent in this side of Massachusetts would be headed to the ISFSI if they did get a real attack. And so I think there's other levels of confidence that we have that would be a very difficult
And what kind of prohibited zone is there for flying over?
None. There's no NOTAM.
Any other questions, Pine?
I had just one, or two maybe. You said that your high temperature cask at Pilgrim was 150, and that was the highest one you. I'm wondering if the kind of fuel that's in the cask has a impact on the those kinds of temperatures, and if you regulate how much of this high burn-up stuff goes to, you know, that sort of thing.
So let me start, John, and I'll let you can chime in if you want. So, you know, I appreciate that question, and I appreciated John's giving the specific values from a cask. And so when you, at the end of our presentation, there is a very long list of the different amendments for the High Storm 100, and you can actually look at the specifics of the loading details and what the parameters are when they load fuel into the canister. And things like burn-up, the high burn-up fuel, those parameters are cited there, and it limits how you can load the cask. And so there are some very good details there. What you'll find in the FSAR, which is listed there, the analysis report provided by Holtec, and in the staff's evaluation report, there's a wealth of information there, and it can be confusing at times because the numbers John provided are actual measurements. But what the licensee and what the staff do is we do look at the extremes. We look at what we call bounding configurations of the loading of the fuel. So we look at the hottest fuel placed in very difficult locations to maximize the conditions in analysis space. And we use those to inform the technical specifications that limit the cask and how it can be loaded and how it can be used in service. And so what the utility will then do is always stay below those technical specifications. And so I think if you go back and you look at those, you'll see what the parameters are for burn-up, decay heat, cooling times, because most of the fuel has been cooled for some period of time in the pool, and so it's all coming down in terms of temperature. And then that limits how the cask can be loaded. And so it's a complex set of parameters to analyze, but that's all spelled out into how they do fuel selection to load the can. John, did you want to add to that at all?
Well, only that when they're loading these cans as well, you know, they're going to try to mix in fuel so that, I mean, you're not going to load it with you're not going to load your cans with your oldest fuel and then get to a point where, now we just have to load the hottest fuel. So there's that constant looking at the design in terms of what gets loaded in what region. So
yeah, I think you're kind of hitting on what my need for assurance was, and that we know too that some of that fuel was in there for I think a year rather than the longer time, and that you've in someone somewhere decided that, hey, the fuel doesn't have to be in the pool 5 years, it can be in 3, you know. So how does that affect it? And just let's have, you know, a clear understanding of what is causing a change in temperatures, and does that mean we have to do something else? And I'm not, and then my follow-up question is only, you know, I'm not really sure. You have an aging management plan, but I don't know what the age is for these casks. So what are we looking at in terms of storage time at this site before it's likely that we're going to have to go to additional packs, or change out the packs, or get the stuff out of Dodge?
So let me go back. Those are great questions. I want to go back to the first question first in terms of the loading. So in Amendment 14, which is one of the more recent amendments for the High Storm 100 design, Holtec proposed and the staff reviewed and approved, and we can get you the ML number. They did reduce the minimum cooling time for some of the assemblies down to 1 year. And so that's in that application, and you've probably seen some of that. Now you have to get into the details as to how they do that, and this is what John was trying to describe, in that you do not have a canister, or at least the staff didn't certify, and Holtec's not proposing, to load a can with nothing but 1 year cooled fuel in every available slot. You got 68 slots in the MPC. And so as John was saying, you have to mix and match some hot fuel with some cool fuel. And these are the bounding parameters that the Holtec has analyzed, and the staff does our confirmatory analysis to show that even in those configurations, all of the components stay below their temperatures that enable them to perform their safety function. And so I think that's, it's an important element to understand that just because it's 1 year cooled fuel doesn't mean that it's a whole can of 1 year cooled fuel. And I'm sorry, you had another question?
I think it had to do with the certificate. So how the High Storm 100, 20 years, 40 years?
So there are a couple of things there, right? So the certificate has a 20-year, or new certificates can now have a 40-year term, and then they have to go into a renewal. Every cask, when it's placed into service, is registered. And so there is a registration, there's a reporting requirement that they have to tell us when that cask was placed into service. So all the casks, every date for every cask out there is understood and monitored. But the term for when you start to talk about renewals is prior to when the cask will actually reach that term. So we're looking at and reviewing the renewals in it, the renewal plan and the aging management plan in advance of them actually reaching that limit.
But what is it here? What is the limit here, 20 years? What?
So the original term was 20 years, and the renewal now will be for 40.
Your original authorization and certificate is for 20 years, and then once you renew it, it's for 40 years?
Up to 40 years,
40
yes.
more years?
Yes.
How does that make sense?
So,
sorry,
there,
I'm not a nuclear expert.
No. So there are two answers to that question, right? And some of them have practical connotations, and some of them are technical, right? The regulations were promulgated so that the original certificate could be reviewed for up to, could be certified for up to 20 years. And basically, that sets the framework that the applicant has to put forward. That's the case that they have to put forward to demonstrate that the materials will perform their function for that period. As we've developed as an industry and as a regulator, we've developed more operating experience with these. Dry cask storage is a relatively new component in the scheme of industries. And so as we've developed additional experience and operating experience on these, in a more recent rulemaking, I want to say it's in the 2012 timeframe, we've actually expanded the term of the initial certification for up to 40 years, and then a renewal for an additional 40 years. So it is something that has been subject to some change and discussion as we've gained additional experience.
So and the reason for that is because you're confident of the materials that are containing this, and you're confident of your understanding of the heat degradation, basically, of the fuel.
So I think there are a number of elements of operating experience that include both our understanding of the materials and their performance, but also of our oversight program. And so we've also gained experience in oversight in terms of our investigations into the manufacturers, the vendors that produce those materials. Their processes are more mature now, and so all of those factors collectively have resulted in that term. We could probably find the rulemaking package that was put forward where we changed that term from 20 to 40 years.
Any other questions, Joseph? Well, if I could just interject, we're going to let this go on because your time here is very valuable to us and to the public, so we're going to run over. Thank you.
If the DOE ever comes up with temporary or permanent storage sites, albeit Texas, New Mexico, Nevada, or wherever it might be, which federal agency will be responsible for then setting up the system for the transfer of the spent fuel casks to one or more of these sites? And will there be, or is there already, a plan prioritizing the different sites? Because you can't have dozens and dozens of sites all over the country, all of a sudden, trucks are hitting the highways from 30 states or whatever the total number of states is. And because the current facilities like Plymouth started at different times to put their spent fuel assemblies in their casks, as you mentioned, you've got all these different time frames. Are those time frames taken into account, or will they be when a priority system is set up, if those sites ever become available, to say, okay, if there's 70 or 80 or 100 sites around the country that are currently storing the spent fuel, that says, okay, for year one, there'll be 5 or 10 or whatever, and these are the locations, and they'll give the current storage facilities sufficient time to prepare to begin the process of loading them on the trucks and so forth and so on. And which agency will be responsible for all of that?
So thank you for the question. That's one we get a lot. And so let me back up a little bit. The two consolidated interim storage facility applications that I spoke about are currently commercial entities. And so the Department of Energy is not involved in those applications. They're mentioned, and there's some discussion about future business options for those entities. But right now, DOE is not a party to those commercial applications. So as I mentioned, spent fuel has been moved in this country, and it can continue as long as it is done so safely, and that's what the NRC's role and our responsibility with the Department of Transportation is. Some of the elements you touch on about the priority and who would move what fuel when are largely business decisions, and the NRC as a safety regulator doesn't engage in the details of who would prioritize what movement of fuel, as long as it's done safely and meets our regulatory requirements. The Department of Energy, the Nuclear Waste Policy Act says what it says. It's quite clear. The national energy policy is not something the NRC engages in. We implement the policy passed by Congress and the President, but we as a safety regulator would not have requirements on who moves what fuel when, only that it be done safely.
So if those commercial sites, one or more of them were approved, then each facility, like Pilgrim, would make a decision that as long as they met your regulations, safety regulations, and DOT's transportation regulations, as long as those were met, however many of these facilities met all those standards could just start shipping them to those approved facilities whenever they wanted to, and all at the same time if they all qualified at the same time.
So I wouldn't presuppose the outcome of the two applications that are under review. Neither has been approved, and there are other permits. But as long as the material is shipped safely, that's what the NRC's mission, and that's what our focus is.
Okay. Jack?
Good evening. Thanks for your participation tonight. I've got a couple of questions that's been asked to this panel before as part of our general discussions. My first question is about aging management. So you talked about some attributes of the aging management program, and I wanted to know, is there a periodicity and sample size specified for physical inspections?
Yes, that's part of the aging management program. It has to have a frequency where the frequency of inspections, the timing of those inspections, and the area that's covered.
My second question is on recertification. Are there physical inspection requirements that need to be performed as part of the recertification process?
Physical inspection of the storage systems? Okay, so the typical scenario is that one of two things. Either the applicant comes in with a pre-application inspection, as we saw with the Maine Yankee case, because they had NAC UMS system that they want to go through renewal. And so they've demonstrated that they can do this, this aging management inspection, and they include that as part of their application, the renewal application that says, here's how we're going to conduct aging management. Here's the results of our pre-application inspection demonstrating that this can actually be done. The alternative to that is to have requirements that each site conduct a baseline inspection when they hit the limit of their initial term, which would be 20 years. And that was done with the TN New Home system. We recognize that a certificate holder is not a user, so they cannot necessarily go in and conduct an inspection. They have to coordinate that with the users. NAC International did that with Maine Yankee, but that was not done for the TN system. So each one of those users of those systems, when they reach the 20-year mark and they go into the period of extended operation, they have a requirement to do a baseline inspection of those systems.
That baseline is a selected sample size, not 100% of the canisters?
For the canisters, yes. For other systems, no. So the exterior concrete surfaces, for example, is 100% inspection.
Okay, thank you.
A question.
Yeah, David.
Going back to the certification process, just to understand. So the Maine Yankee and the Holtec high storm multi-purpose canisters down in Plymouth were both originally certified for 20 years, right? So it sounds like you've made changes to the certification process and you're open to recertifying both of those storage locations for up to 40 years, Maine as well as Pilgrim?
It's not the location, it's the actual systems.
Understood. I don't know that they're the same system.
They're different systems. They're both certificate of compliance systems that can be used by a general licensee. And yes, both of those systems could apply for renewal for up to 40 years.
All right, so in the case of Plymouth, we know the original system was certified for 20 years, and now that Holtec is coming up for recertifying new applications for the same system, they're seeking a 40-year certification, as is provided for you folks, by you folks.
I believe that's true.
So have there been any changes in the Holtec design from the systems that were certified for 20 years originally and are currently being used in the systems that Holtec is currently seeking a new certification of 40 years for?
So it's not a change to the system, it's a change to what they have to do. So in the initial 20-year period, they had some maintenance that had to take place. And in the renewal application, they have to go through the same process that I described, but they have to do an assessment of the aging management requirements for that system. That includes things like inspections to detect aging effects before they have an issue that causes them to lose an important safety function. So the design of the system isn't changing to going through a renewal application. It's the requirements that they have to do to show that that system can continue to operate safely, and that includes active aging management.
So to simplify my question, so the same system Holtec is currently seeking a 40-year certification for is the same design that they received the 20-year certification for and is currently in use at Plymouth?
Yes.
Thank you.
Joe, I'm going to ask some questions. Go ahead. Follow up on what I was asking earlier, and I appreciate your response earlier. Is there any time limit, statutory or regulatory, on the review process for any of these commercial storage facilities? In other words, does the review process to give a thumbs up or down have to be done within 2 years, 5 years, 3 years, 12 months, whatever?
No, there are no current statutory limits on, or regulatory limits on how long that review can take.
Again, restating what everybody has, how much we appreciate you being here. I'm going to make a quick comment, and then I have literally pages of questions, which I'm not going to torture you or the public or my fellow panel members with, but I'm going to focus on a couple. The first is a comment. Your ability to bifurcate the regulatory issues to avoid questions like liability, questions like warranties, is something that I think it's disturbing to all of us. It's the hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil bifurcation of regulatory responsibility. And one of the key issues comes back to, you said that the licensee would always be responsible. In this case, we have a licensee who is a limited liability corporation that was set up specifically for this project, and who do we go chase when the unfortunate occurs? You say, and correct me if I'm wrong, that that's not really the role of the NRC. You're worried about safety, and you're worried about the materials, and you're worried about the process, but you're not really that concerned with, they won't tell us what the warranty period is because they say it's proprietary. They won't tell us, even though the money, the $1 billion+ was ratepayers' dollars in interest that paid for it, we still don't know. So despite your best efforts, and I can't tell you how much we appreciate it, we have real heartburn, as I know people around the nation do, with this process that you're strapped by. It's wrong, it needs to be corrected. So with that, let me ask you a couple of specifics and then I'll get over it. Each ton maybe weighs about 150 tons, is that it, these canister at? If I did my math right, that's about 360,000 pounds. Am I correct in saying, according to the DOT's May 2015 statement, that on federal highways you can't transport more than 80,000 pounds?
I'm not familiar with the DOT's requirements there.
Pretty sure it is. It's May 2015.
I will say
Sean, one
that.
thing though, you're talking about the overpack, you're including the overpack, which
Yeah.
wouldn't be transported. you're
So
talking about
what would be the weight?
That I don't know, but what I'm saying is, because as we met with DOT,
Yeah.
and this was part of their discovery, but it's the multi-purpose canister on the inside that comes out into a travel canister. So I just want to say, the weight of the overpack that sits on it is very
Yeah.
different than what would transport.
I'd love to hear what those numbers are. Because one of our big concerns, of course, and I'll get to it in another question in a brief moment, but is how do you move the stuff, if ever? How do we move it? I mean, there's been discussions of barges, and for those of us local that know Browns Bank, it's got to be a big dredging project. So that's one of my questions. I'd appreciate getting that answer. Have you guys ever, and many may not have heard of this, it's called independent verification validation. It's a process, did I hear a laugh somewhere? It's a process that was really embraced following the tragic Nassau accident. Do you guys ever consider using independent verification validation so it's not just your folks taking a 30-minute look around the top of the canister, but that it's an independent organization? Have you ever thought about doing that?
So the NRC is an independent regulatory body, and we are separated from the administration for that purpose, so that we can focus on safety. And so I believe we do have that independent verification. I tried to speak to that in my presentation when I talked about the licensing process, where our reviewers are independent of the applicant, they're independent of the utility, and they rely on their professional experience to evaluate those designs.
Okay. I understand the answer. I just think you understand the credibility gap that may exist between the people you are trying to serve and what you're doing. Because sometimes there are folks that don't believe it's an independent authority. And then I'll limit this last one. I have a great deal of concerns about security. It's sort of my line of work. And, you know, I actually don't want to get into a detailed discussion about this in a public meeting, but there's been a great deal of discussion about, well, it could take a fighter jet flying into one of these things and it wouldn't work. And for all of those that remember the horrible tragedy at the Muir Building in Oklahoma, the distances involved, and it wasn't 1 or 2 city blocks with a dirty bomb. It was a U-Haul truck that travels every road every day. It took out 15 blocks of a city. Now, not all of these buildings were hardened, not like this. But the proximity to these casks in a publicly used road that U-Haul trucks go down every day is absurd. And no amount of automatic weapons and well-trained staff and fences with, razor wire is going to solve this. And I personally would like to hear what the plan is to protect, not against the absurd, but against the probable and easy. That's all.
There is a vehicle barrier system, and certainly, you can debate whether that's adequate, but it's part of the design of the ISFSI.
Do you think that's an acceptable design for the scenarios that are possible?
Personally, I do.
Okay, that's all I'm asking. Okay. With that, I'm sorry that we've gone over. For those of you who are regular attendees, I'm a stickler on time. I would ask you to stay because we like to give the public an opportunity to also ask questions, but I will keep that to the limit. Pat, you're on. Thank you again.
Thank you. I'll try to make up some time. I usually don't take my full 15 minutes. So thank you. Just give a quick update on work progress at the site. We did remove the 160-foot old abandoned meteorological tower. We did complete that safely with pre-job brief planning, some drop object prevention, and good employee engagement with the contractor that came on site to do that. It came down in 4 sections, and we completed that in 1 day. I think you can see some pictures of it coming apart, and then bottom right hand is the excavator that I could see out my office window crunching it up, which is pretty impressive. Inside, when I've said in the past, our focus right now is on the refuel floor and getting it prepared for the fuel campaign. This is what I mean by that, is we've cut up the containment head. We've been cutting that and rigging that into pieces. As you can see on the picture on the left, that's one of the pieces having been cut and moving along over to the manway, and the one on the right being lowered down the manway for storage until we do move that eventually. So that work was done and completed last week. So as you can see on the one on the left, that was about half the containment head had been removed already, and now that space is empty. In addition to that, we've been working on what are called the dryer separator pit blocks, cutting those in half. There's a picture of one on the right. The picture on the left shows with the cavities, actually, that's the reactor, would be flooded up. When that is, when we were operating and that was down, those blocks would slide in between the reactor cavity and the dryer separator pit. So I just wanted to give a perspective as to what those blocks were. Now, on to staffing, because I know that's an important one to everyone. So we are going to recalibrate our resources. I think I spoke to that last time on April 3rd. 47 to 52 employees will be displaced. The number variance is that we are working with some of those team members to transition over to the whole tech fuel team and work on the potential work on the fuel campaign. Sorry. And just kind of as an update, I know I had talked a little bit about what we're planning to do, but during transition, 27 employees have found other employment. This is obviously good because they've moved on to jobs that they found rewarding. A lot of them have gone to Eversource. I think about a third of that number has gone to Eversource. There's been 4 that went to Commonwealth of Mass, and a number have gone to local police and TSA. But what that actually does is it allows people that want to stay on the project that might have been bumped to stay on with employment. In addition, we continue to work with the Department of Career Services and have a couple of additional sessions related to resume writing, job interview skills for those separating. Those are planned in March. And then just kind of finally, governmental interactions. We did have senior leadership of CDI and HDI meet with town officials just to discuss high-level interests that the town has. We have presented pretty much monthly at this point project updates to the select board as well. We did, site leadership met with Brett Muratori, Chairman Tavares, the town manager, and Kevin and Sean, vice chair and chair of the NDCAP, and just a general discussion and overview of the project and any concerns they may have. I think it was mentioned earlier by the NRC, but we are continuing to work with Plymouth Fire as part of the move to an incipient fire brigade. We are familiarizing the entire Plymouth Fire Department with the site, bringing them on. Every Wednesday, it's been about 30 to 40 individuals in two classes to come through. They get a tour, they do questions and answers with our staff and kind of work through any concerns that they have. We have been trying to be open and help where we can, and to that effect, Mass State Police K-9 unit in the region reached out to use our Chiltonville Training Center for some, what they would consider real-life search and rescue for drugs, weapons, things along those lines. So they've been doing that roughly 1 day per week, not every week, but when they have some foul weather, they'll usually just reach out and come and use the facility. And then additionally have been talking to Hank Leip, the emergency manager in Plymouth. With the 400th events this year in Plymouth, there's a need by the community and the Red Cross to have a worst case scenario kind of staging area where if something were to happen where they would need a family reunification center. They described it as if there were a mass casualty, mass injury event at one of the larger events in the community, they were looking for a space, and we've offered to allow them to use the Chiltonville facility for that. And that's pretty much all I had.
Any questions? Lots of questions. Joe, let's start down the end.
Patrick, in the past couple of months, you gave us a chart, I believe, that showed the different phases of the decommissioning, and I thought it was very helpful giving you an image of what will occur during the phases. Would it be possible in the future, when you provide us with the monthly updates of where the decommissioning process is, to try and see if you could do it in the context of that chart, of the plan with the different phases? I understand, at least I think I understood at the time, that some of the decommissioning procedures could actually be going on in multiple phases, so there can be some overlap between the phases, which is fine. But I thought that that chart, at least for me, was a real visual help. And so if these updates could be put in that context of which phases they're in, I think it would give a little more complete picture as to where the process is.
Sure, I understand where you're coming from. In full disclosure, that chart ended up as an action in litigation against us, which is my hesitation. What I'm trying to do is provide kind of the major workflows that I had spoke to at that meeting. It kind of updates on that part of the project. So reactor segmentation, refuel floor work was basically the focus of tonight. But I'll put it in some better context that kind of harkens back to that as best I can.
Thanks.
David?
So a couple questions, Pat. So if I understood correctly, you guys are cutting up the containment head?
Yes.
And cutting up what looked like containment blocks. You used a different term for those, I think.
Yeah.
So
Dryer separator pit blocks, yes.
What do we call those?
Dryer separator pit, that's what the pit on this side of the reactor would be for tool storage. So it's very dark, but I think it's the dryer separator pit is, or the dryer separator is actually in the pit underwater.
Great, thanks. There's two quick questions on that. Firstly, which, if either of those, is radionuclide contaminated material? That's question one. And question two, what are you doing with any debris that you generate?
John, do you mind speaking to that? Because I know you have a little bit more of the details of the process with RP and.
Yeah, we're staging the materials right now, but it's very low contamination and activity, like no activity on these components right now. That answer your question?
So when you say low contamination or low activity, those terms are interchangeable in your vernacular?
Yeah, I mean, you can see where the folks are relative to the block.
Yep.
And there isn't any plastic or sheathing over it, so it's all fixed.
Great, and you're just storing that on site for now?
For now, yes.
Correct. Yeah, and prior to cutting it up, I believe we did lead abatement or lead testing to ensure that there weren't any of those materials present.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you, Pat. Thank you. Moving on to old business, and this is perhaps where we can pick up some time. Any old business that anyone would like to discuss? Hearing none, having saved 10 minutes, I'll go on to new business. I have one point of new business, but does anybody else get any new business that they'd like to discuss? Hearing none, I'd like to suggest that the next 2 months, March and April, that the panel focus on the reuse and economic development on the site, that we will bring in some folks to talk about potential things. Any discussion on that idea for the next 2 months? Pat, do you have discussion?
Well, it's more of a point,
Okay.
I have a question, I have a comment on that.
Yes.
So one of the key parts of the process that we have upcoming will be when Holtec selects who are they going to use for their site characterization, and then a schedule of how that's going to take place over the next year, so that should not fall off our radar. That's coming close to fruition, so
Pat,
I'd like
when
to
do you,
keep that
or
on.
John, when do you think you're gonna be doing that?
We're in the process, we've selected a bidder, there were 3 bids, but we've selected a bidder working through the contract. Did mention this tonight at the subcommittee meeting. Provided them with a rough scope of work, but I don't have an anticipated finish on the contract, but I know that they've been in negotiations down in Camden as recently as last week.
I have a follow-up to that. So if Pine, our chairperson, doesn't protest for the subcommittee could follow that, which we are doing, and report that out to the NDCAP full panel, and that would free up an opportunity for you to work on those other agenda items.
I'm open. This is my suggestion. It's for discussion, and I think that's a great way to handle it through the working group. Yeah, Joe.
When you mentioned for the next couple of meetings, you focus on economic development, you mean just of the site that's being decontaminated, or the 1,500 acres
The entire. I'd like to get the town planner in, for example.
Wait a minute. Pine's saying the entire thing, is that what you said?
I'm saying the entire thing.
Okay.
That's my suggestion.
Because there's been a lot of ongoing discussion within the town and with the select board over the past couple of years about that issue. And there have been a number of options that have been discussed, and I'm sure there'll be many more. But one of them has been to not develop it at all and to leave it as open space. Well, even that option has a potentially significant economic impact to the town, because no taxes would be realized as a result of that. So maybe in the discussions of the next couple of meetings, we can also look at the comprehensive economic issue.
That's the idea.
Not just, if it was developed, what are the options of what should go there? Because that's a big issue also.
Big issue.
And there's a lot of politics behind that, keeping open spacing.
No. In Plymouth? No. Yes, David.
I just wanted to ask what our motivation is in doing that. And I'm asking that question not to be a wise guy, but to kind of put in the context of what the NDCAP is tasked with.
Yeah.
So I'm presuming we're looking to do that so we can further advise recommendations on what future efforts might look like to remediate or decommission consistent with those goals.
Yeah. You're absolutely correct. And there's a bunch of motivational factors that led me to make this suggestion. And that's what it is at this point. There are new opportunities, it appears, for a potential reuse of some of the switching equipment again. This is all, and that's certainly part of the decommission. What happens? Certainly part of the long-term economic plan. What happens? These are stranded assets now, and can you turn them into tax base for the town without any disruption? My suggestion is, let's just explore it. Let's perhaps hear, once again, on the RKG report and other reports. Let's hear from the town planner. Let's hear, so that we can provide the best possible advice, not only to the governor and to the legislature, but to the citizens as well as the town. That's why I'm making the suggestion, but I have no pride of authorship on this. So.
Sean, I would agree with you. I mean, we've had
My
discussions.
God.
Yeah, I know.
Did you get that, Seth?
Yes. No, we've had discussions with the town. Obviously, that's been one of their biggest concerns, is the use of the land. And we've made it clear that right now we don't have a plan, but we would like to hear what the town is thinking. Sure, I could read the RKG report, but things may have changed since then. And obviously, I think some people might ask, well, why are you looking at that now? Is anyone who's ever done business in Plymouth, it does take a little while to work through the zoning and building process for anything in this town. Never mind, what the town might want to reuse, potential reuse the land for, or how that would lay out. So yeah, I would welcome that.
Jack?
So I think we're trying to put the cars in the train in the right order, right? So we've got several things that we're looking at and we're concerned with, and I'm not saying that economic development isn't a key part of that, but if we take our eye off the ball on what is a cleanup standard. Now, we've been trying to work with Holtec on cleanup standards and what that site's gonna look like. We haven't resolved that yet. We haven't resolved issues with the casks and how are they inspected and how are they gonna be, how are they gonna keep the people in Plymouth safe for the next 80 years if they go through two recertification processes. So I agree with you, that's a topic of discussion for us to do, but I think our obligation to the governor is to continue to report out. We have not made any progress with Holtec on resolving how is that site going to be cleaned up and what's it going to look like, and then once that's figured out, we can figure out, okay, these are the available uses for that property.
Again, I have no pride of authorship on this. I'm fine with it. I'm looking for a consensus of the panel. Of what would you like me to make sure it happens, including perhaps changes?
Right, so I think you probably just caught a few people off guard by saying we're going to focus the next 2 months just on that thing, and to get a planner to come in and say, hey, here's some of those options to do, that great, that's good information that we all need to work through. I just don't want us to take the foot off the pedal, so to speak, till we are resolved on what is the end use of that site going to look like from a characterization standpoint, not just radiological. We've got other issues that the DEP has identified that we want to ensure is addressed.
To Jack's point, not to put you on the spot, Pat. Do you think that the contract issues would be resolved by our next monthly meeting to bring somebody in here from the group that you've chosen?
I wouldn't venture to guess at this point. What I was going to say before when I was kind of walking back is I have been working, and tell me to stop or not, but I was working to try to bring the cask experts at the company back in.
That would be great.
All right, so that's what I was working to do because the selectmen have always also asked for that. They've offered up a date of the 17th, and to me, it seems to work.
That would be great.
Okay, so that's what I'm working towards. I haven't promised it yet because the selectmen haven't given me that as a date that works for them, but I want to piggyback it if I can.
And
So-
just, Kevin, that site characterization contract, that's just going to tell us who's going to come in
Right.
and how are they going to look. It's not going to resolve for us what is going to remain when they're done doing the cleanup.
I was just thinking in terms of taking it step by step. If we know who's going to come in and do that study, it'd be great to take that step and hear what their
To get
plans
that
are and get that
identified.
information out to
Absolutely. It's just
everybody.
one of the steps
Right,
on
I
that.
agree,
Well,
absolutely.
Let me ask Pat, are you committing for the next meeting to bring in your folks to talk about dry cask?
That's what I'm working to do.
I'm
No, I know. I just want the selectmen to commit to
Yeah.
that date, which I haven't gotten from the chairman yet. But I've sent him a message a couple times. So as soon as he confirms the 17th, I'll make sure that to confirm the 16th. And I'll do that. I'll commit to you that I'll do that by the end of the week if something changes.
Point of
Two
information.
more quick ones. Yes, John.
Sean, thank you. I think that's a good suggestion, but I think we will be taking our eye off the ball if we don't really focus on safety. Safety is the primary issue that this panel has put together, not economic development. And when we speak to Plymouth, it's not only Plymouth, it's probably a 50 to 100 mile radius, including Cape Cod, including other parts of the state. So our focus really should continue to be on the safety and the decommissioning of that facility versus economic development, in my opinion.
Joseph?
I think one of the frustrations that probably everybody has is, and it's not new, we've had endless discussions on all kinds of important issues relevant to the decommissioning and other things. We've included all those, as I've said before, in annual reports. We don't even get a response to our annual reports from the 3 entities that we're required by law to send them to. Yes, safety is a major issue. Environmental concerns are major issues, and so forth and so on. We've raised them. how many more times are we going to raise the same issues? It's up to the Commonwealth to decide what it's going to do. And I think in the long run, hopefully once this litigation is over, we can engage in a little more discussion as to where is the Commonwealth and where is the Commonwealth going to focus on all these different issues that this panel has raised but never had responses to. So I look at safety, yes, it's very important, but it's only one of a whole host of issues that are important. We don't know what the Commonwealth is going to do. We've asked over and over, and we don't get a response. Typically, we're told that
Could you be more specific on what you're asking us for over and over again?
I'm sorry?
Could you be more specific on what you're asking us for over and over again?
Well, safety is the one you brought up, and we've discussed safety over and over. We've discussed environmental issues. We've discussed PSDAR. We've discussed all the things that were in our reports. The great bulk of them are still open. So how many times are we going to discuss the same things?
Well,
I think till it's resolved.
One second, David.
I was just going to respond by acknowledging that this group has not received a written statement from the interagency work group or the administration relative to receipt of the annual reports. But I can tell you, as a member of the interagency work group, and Sam is on it, and Jack is on it, and if Robert were here, he's also on it, that those reports, we take them very seriously. The folks here contribute to them, and the other folks in the interagency work group look at them. We make sure they're provided, and they absolutely are helpful. And, we look to that sort of information as we work towards trying to find the settlement that you all know we are attempting to reach. And, hopefully that'll be done through some sort of mutually agreeable arrangement. And on a parallel track, we continue to pursue the legal avenues that we believe are available to us. And, we also use that information to inform that approach. So I'm not suggesting necessarily that absolutely everything that is present in each and every annual report is going to find its way into whatever settlement the Commonwealth ultimately reaches. But what I am saying is the information that gets filtered up is valuable, and safety is going to continue to be very valuable information. I learned things tonight. I think other folks in the panel learned things tonight we didn't know before, and that is helpful. So I do believe we should continue to focus on safety, and to the extent that when we look at economic development, I think we look at that with an eye towards better informing where we ultimately end up in making sure that we have a final arrangement out there that is safe. I think that's the probably first and foremost thinking when we look at economic development. But I do appreciate, I'm not a resident of Plymouth, but I do appreciate that it's a big change in how Plymouth's tax structure is going to work without that revenue, and that Plymouth's going to need to think about that and how they address that. And I don't think that information is going to be a lot less valuable than the safety information. So I'd like both. I think I can speak for the interagency work group, and Sam and Jack will correct me if I'm wrong, that I think we would value information in both areas, but first and foremost, safety.
Well, I think we appreciate that, but still, the panel doesn't know, and I can understand because of the litigation issue, that there's a limit on what you can say. Understand that and appreciate it. But at the same time, because of that, there's no way of knowing how long this litigation is going to take to get resolved. It's out of a lot of people's hands, the DC court system and so forth and so on. But because of that, the panel doesn't have the ability or the knowledge of what are the issues that the panel has raised that the Commonwealth is going to undertake either as part of the negotiations with the licensee and/or once that's over and whatever success there is in those negotiations, how many of those items were in our reports? Let's just say, pick any numbers we want. Let's just say there was a total of 20 items in the annual reports, and the Commonwealth wants to negotiate and successfully negotiates 5, 6, 7, 8 of them based on the Commonwealth's priorities, right? That would mean then all the rest of them are left on the table. And then my question would be, okay, if those remaining issues that we've raised are not going to be taken up by the Commonwealth in negotiations, what does the panel want to do with them? Are they still important to the panel? Do we want to get back into new discussions on those items and say, okay, we want to take an additional action? We know the Commonwealth doesn't want to address, for whatever reasons, X number of them, but does the panel want to pursue trying to recommend, again, for whatever new reasons, why they're important, that somebody's got to deal with them?
Thank you. In deference to our guests and also to the public, unfortunately, I'm going to shut this discussion down at the moment, although we could go on for a good constructive period. I will say that what I'll focus on then for next month is with our friends from Holtec to get them here. That's what I'll focus on, and we'll have more time for new business to continue this discussion. With that, we're going to go to public comment. For our friends from the NRC who may not be familiar with this, we may do this a little differently than you've seen in other meetings. So how many people tonight would like to ask a question? I'm going to count them. 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 people, right? Each of you shall be allotted 5 minutes. Jim, let's start. Oh, I don't want to get in between this.
I can't. Well, Sean, as everyone else knows on the panel knows, I sent you 5 pages of questions. Sean says he has pages of questions. So it's very, very clear that there are many, many questions that there's nowhere near time, frankly, to ask or to get an answer from you about tonight. And I would hope that you would accept written questions and give us the answers when we get time to.
Just turn the microphone off.
This one? It's bright. Okay. I'd like to basically start at the moment on, I'm going to use your Maine Yankee as an example. Maine Yankee, how long did you say the cask had been there? 17 years?
Loaded in 2002.
So, and basically, was this are these the longest in existence casks in the U.S.? I thought I heard you say that.
No, they're the longest ones at that site.
What are the longest period?
Surrey.
Going back to?
1986.
Which is now about 34 years ago. So I think it's fair to say that the NRC's database on how long the cask last is 34 years. On the basis of that database, they're saying, oh, gee, let's go 80, and our regs don't require you to place anything for 100. When you looked at Maine Yankee, how many casks did you look at?
I looked at 1 GTCC and 1 spent fuel.
How many are there?
60 spent fuel, 4 GTCC.
So 2 out of 100.
2 out of 64.
Okay, number's about the same. When you looked at those, it sounded like things you thought were important were cracks, pressure, temperature, and I assume, did anybody look for helium?
No.
Why not? Isn't the presence of helium a fairly good indicator of an incipient problem?
So you're saying doing like a helium leak check of the cask?
Yeah, are you finding it? Test?
I think it would be very difficult to find helium leak test on a canister like that. Helium leak test usually is done in a chamber where you have a controlled volume of the atmosphere to detect helium, not in an open space.
But you don't have an open space really to speak of in that gap between the canister and bag. Supposedly you've got a small passage through which you get airflow. Okay. And I assume it would be possible to put temperature sensors, pressure sensors, and helium sensors into that space.
Temperature sensors are already there.
How often are they read?
They don't use the temperature sensors for their assessment.
That's the answer.
They
In other words, they're there, but at NRC, why don't you require online, real-time readout of the indicators of incipient problems?
Because they monitor the temperature of the cask by making sure that the vents are clear of any obstruction.
And as long as those vents are clear, you're sure there's no problem.
For the heat removal of the cask, absolutely.
What about this Russian doll that's been talked about? That would seal off the vents.
No, the Russian doll doesn't seal off the vents at all. The Russian doll would put a canister inside of another can, which is available to them
Well,
at venue.
the Russian doll is an overpack.
No, the Russian doll is an overpack of a canister, not the entire
Has it been approved?
We've never approved one. It's been built.
Has it ever been used and tested?
Never needed it.
That's not my question. Has it ever been used and tested?
It's been tested, sure, but it's never been needed.
And you've never approved it?
No, we haven't.
Have you been asked to approve it?
I don't believe so. It was a requirement by the state.
Okay. Holtec put out a technical bulletin in which they lauded their double-walled casks that they've been using at Chernobyl. They said they are much, much better than what they've been using here now at Pilgrim. Have you ever approved it?
We never received an application for one.
So they haven't even bothered to ask you to approve it, even though they say it's better. Is that fair?
We haven't received an application. That's all I can answer.
Jim, 30 seconds.
Take me 30 seconds just to find my glasses, but I'll have to do with that. Okay, there's one other, 30 seconds, I'll only touch
We'll give you the waiver on the glass.
I'll just touch one subject. You were talking about the interim storage sites that are unplanned out in New Mexico and West Texas. Those are, applications for those are pending, right? Am I also correct that under existing law, those can't be built or used? The present law requires DOE to take stuff to a permanent storage site. The report that talked about interim storage made very clear that legislative action was required. And to my understanding, there's been absolutely none. Is that accurate as far as you know?
I don't believe that's
What's inaccurate about it?
So I would speak first as a factual matter. The NRC has issued a license for an interim storage facility that is similar to the ones that are currently underway.
To whom?
Jim?
If you could tell me to whom, it would make it.
Yeah.
So that is the private fuel storage facility that was licensed in Utah. The Nuclear Waste Policy Act does have provisions and imposes requirements upon the Department of Energy. But it is not the NRC's position that that prevents the licensing of other facilities, as was demonstrated in the case of the private fuel storage facility.
Has DOE taken
Jim.
title to things that have been transferred to
Jim.
companies that have been licensed?
Jim, if you want to yield to
Sure.
Mary to follow it up.
Excuse me, they need a mic for this.
Yeah.
If we can use Dan, we'll get this one.
Who needs a mic? Oh, I get it. Okay, is that on?
Make sure you get your pad behind it.
Mary, be careful. You're
Oh, that's okay.
you got to
Oh,
We were talking about liability earlier, Mary.
For the safety guys.
Yeah.
I also have a list of questions, and we'll mail them to you and look forward to a response. I'm particularly concerned about security. The U.S. government has warned that the threat of terrorism is real and unlikely to decrease. Pilgrim's casks are lined up 362 feet, which is a couple of feet more than a football field, from a public road. The walls of the Holtec canisters, this is all public information on your website, provided by Dr. Gordon Thompson, provided by the union concerned scientists, Ed Lyman, and others, okay? So I'm not speaking secrets. The walls of the canisters used at Pilgrim are 0.5 inches thick. The walls of the surrounding outer concrete are 26.8 thick. Military-type weapons that are available today to those who know how to use them, know how to get them, can penetrate the canisters and the concrete. They can be shot from 1.5 miles away. An M2A3 shaped charge can penetrate 26 inches of concrete, 12 inches of armor plate. That's 38 inches. An M3 charge can penetrate 60 inches of concrete and at least 20 inches of armor plate. That's 80 inches. As discussed by Ed Lyman and discussed by Dr. Gordon Thompson at many sites, and before the NRC, before the U.S. Senate, etc., points out the size of the hole that would be created and the likelihood that then a explosive would be put into the hole, and the cesium content of the canister is half the cesium-137 released at Chernobyl. What this tells me is the prudent measure for NRC to require would be a measure that could prevent a line-of-sight attack, which is very doable, and there are people in this world who would like to do it and get the weapons to do it. Gravel and earth berms are literally dirt cheap. They could be required to be put around the ISFSI. Just to get rid of that, it would be a really good PR move on the part of Holtec. Not expensive, I'm not being unrealistic. This could be done. Obviously, a reinforced building, you could go on and on. But you could put a berm around. Also, it struck me as unconscionable that the NRC did not require the cyber rules to be effectuated. You talk about communication equipment that these guards have. You talk about security, fences, this and that. Can any of these be impacted? I expect they probably can. Would that be hard to require? Would it be hard for Holtec to do? Again, not a big ticket item, but these two would be two big steps for public safety and security in the world going forward when you consider how long these targets, if you will be there. So you can wait to take these messages to require these options after there is an attack on some cask. But why not take the step before to save unnecessary suffering?
Thank you, Mary. Diane?
Thank you. Isn't it absurd that a canister that has a warranty of 25 years is given a renewal of a 40-year license? It doesn't make sense at all. And if the concrete fails around these Holtec casks, the warranty is null and void. Also, the NRC said they verified components that comply with the design, but in fact, Vermont Yankee had to halt loading casks because of a Holtec design change that was not approved by the NRC. NRC says monitoring casks, they monitor cask loading, they're elbow to elbow with folks right on the site. That's great. But contractors at Holtec, and you know what I'm going to talk about, it's in an OPEX. A 50-ton canister loaded with highly radioactive waste was in danger of falling at San Onofre due to, quote, Southern California Edison's deficiencies involving training, equipment, procedures, and oversight and corrective actions, according to an NRC report. You blamed it all on Southern California. Where was your oversight? Where was your oversight? In August, the event was not the first time a canister loading went awry, the NRC reported in a report released, citing multiple procedural inadequacies. This is systemic in the industry. So to say that everything's fine and rosy, it's not true. It is not true. And lastly, what would you say, you mentioned an intrusion detection system on a nuclear reactor site, and especially on a pad. How much time do you think security should go if somebody were on the site, past the no trespassing signs, past the armed guard signs, past the trespassers will be prosecuted signs where it says danger, and they have the dry cask in line of sight? How long do you think it should take Holtec or Entergy to have detected somebody like that, or a couple of people? 5 minutes, 3 minutes?
I don't have an answer to your question. The process is to detect people at the IDS, not out on the site.
Okay, so somebody could go and have a line of sight to the ISFSI, and the security doesn't have to address that?
That's correct.
Wow. I don't know about you, but I was all shocked with what Paul Blanche said last week. This is a very serious situation. Thank you for all the
Thank you,
work.
Diane. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Ed Perry. I'm a news reporter for WATD FM in Marshfield and WMEX in Boston and WBSM in Brockton. And I have a question that I'd like to ask both the NRC folks, and then depending on their answer, to ask one of the members of the board here. I don't know who would like to answer, but let me ask you the first question here, and whichever one of you would like to answer it, that would be fine. Let's just suppose that 2 years from now, the federal government decides to refund Yucca Mountain as a repository for spent nuclear fuel, and says, and in two years after that, they will be accepting spent nuclear fuel from all over the country, and that the spent nuclear fuel that currently lives in Plymouth could become a resident of Nevada. What options would be available to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, the town of Plymouth, and the county of Plymouth County to make this happen, to get the spent fuel rods to head off quickly to Nevada? Who would like to answer that?
So as I mentioned during my talk, so the NRC doesn't engage in the prioritization of the shipment of spent fuel. So that's a matter that would have to be dealt with by the Department of Energy. We are very concerned about the safety of those shipments, and we do want to make sure that the transportation packages are properly certified and designed to ensure the safe shipment. But there are certain business decisions, and those movements of fuel are not within our regulatory purview.
So basically, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, while it could say, here's how you store the spent fuel safely, cannot say to an organization that, like the folks that are in charge now of the nuclear power plant, here is where you must take that fuel. You must get it out of Massachusetts, because there is an option now that does not involve keeping it here.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite follow the question.
Right. In other words, the federal government, even though one part of it might be funding the nuclear spent fuel repository in Nevada, that the NRC doesn't have the ability to say to the people who are managing the spent fuel in Plymouth, hey, it's time to take it where we had said it was going to go in the beginning.
So energy policy is established by the federal government. The NRC does not create that policy, but we do seek to implement the safety elements of that policy.
Well, given your experience with the NRC, would you, if you were a consultant to the town of Plymouth, would you recommend that that spent fuel be moved to Nevada?
So the NRC, our mission is a safety mission. As long as the material is maintained safely, that's our focus.
Okay, thank you. Now, I'd like to sort of bring the same question over to the...
Sean, I don't mind taking it.
Do you want to take it?
I don't mind taking it.
You don't want to take it? Does anybody want to answer it? Does anybody want to offer an opinion?
Yeah. Sure. And to your question, we look forward to the DOE. Yeah.
One more minute.
Yeah, we look forward to the DOE taking their responsibility that they've had.
So you're Patrick O'Brien.
Yes.
And you're the representative here from CDI.
Yep.
And just for my information, very quickly, what does CDI do?
We're the decommissioning general contractor.
Okay. So you are the people who are decommissioning the nuclear power plant.
Correct.
Now, if they were to reopen or actually finally open Yucca Mountain in Nevada, what would the town of Plymouth and the state of Massachusetts need to do to get you to take that spent fuel rod out of this state, out of this county, out of this town, and take it out to Nevada to a government-sponsored storage area?
So as the licensee, we look forward to the DOE fulfilling their obligation that they've had for over 20 years to take the fuel off site. We've had meetings with the Department of Energy. They've come and done a site assessment for potential ways that they would be required to move the fuel. And they're looking at those options. I believe their report is supposed to be out, or an updated report sometime middle of this year. It would speak to, obviously, all the plants that have closed prior, because they have responsibility for every nuclear power plant where the fuel is. But the update will do Oyster Creek and Pilgrim.
Could you make
No, Ed, we got it really. In the sense of fairness, we need to.
Am I out of time?
You're out of time.
I'm out of time. Okay.
Thank you, though, Ed. After the meeting's over, I'm sure you can find somebody. Thank you. Thanks, Ed.
Hi, I'm Rosemary Shields. I'm with the League of Women Voters of the Cape Cod area, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to ask a question. I was here last month when Paul Blanche was here, and he was very impressive. He's 50 years of, a nuclear engineer and safety. And he, brought up that the Holtec dry casks have steel cores of only 5/8 of an inch. In comparison, the world standard, like in Germany, they have 10 to 12-inch steel cores, and I think also at Fukushima. What does the Nuclear Regulatory Commission think about 10 to 12-inch steel cores as far as safety goes? And why isn't that a standard?
So we don't prescribe the design of the canisters. We review the design of the canisters and our storage systems, and all of those canisters, whether they're a thick wall design with seals on it with a bolted lid closure, or a welded stainless steel system, they all have to meet the regulations in Part 72, and that's what we review too. So that all of the systems are meet our regulations for safety.
There for safety, but the NRC doesn't have like a preference at all, like, gee, wouldn't 10 to 12 inches of a steel core be really, really great and, really, help as far as aging casks, et cetera?
No.
You have no opinion on
No,
that
we do not have a preference.
Safety, that kind of safety. Okay, that's interesting. One of the things that Mr. Blanche said is Holtec already has an improved design for double-walled casks for approval before the NRC.
We have not received an application for a double wall canister at the NRC.
You have not received that?
We have not.
Okay. Well, that's contrary to what, Mr.
They are accurate. We have not put that design forward. The only design that's used is overseas.
Okay, well, I'm just quoting Mr. Blanche, and, but they do use that overseas.
I believe he referenced Germany, which is...
That Holtec uses.
Was it Chernobyl? I'm sorry.
Chernobyl.
We're licensed in 14 different countries with our cask design, and we're in 25% of the nuclear plants around the world.
So in other words, then Holtec has not applied for this double-walled canister for NRC?
That is correct.
Okay, thank you. Well, I didn't hear that last month. Okay, but the other thing is, where's the president on Yucca Mountain? I can't follow. I know you're an independent agent. I know you're an independent agency.
Nobody's going to take that.
Oh. Darn. Okay, well, may I quote Allison McFarland, chair of the NRC, that Yucca is a political ploy. It doesn't meet criteria for a stable, dry site. All right, but I think she's got credibility as a former chair. Thank you, that's all I have to say.
So again, before I ask for a motion to adjourn, I want to thank you very, very much for joining us this evening, the time, the effort. We'll be putting the PowerPoint presentation up on the NDCAP website. And again, thank you very much. We really do appreciate it. Do I hear a motion to adjourn? So moved. Second? Second. All in favor?
Third, fourth, fifth, sixth.